Back for your ears only, I'm David Alpern with this quote from last week's news. It's been weighing heavy on my heart. That was Ferguson, Missouri Police Chief Thomas Jackson on a video in which he expressed sorrow for a white officer's fatal shooting of unarmed black teen Michael Brown and apologized for the hours Brown's body lay in the street pending crime scene investigation. But Jackson triggered more disruption by attempting to join community protesters. Also last week, a state trooper in Columbia, South Carolina, was fired and arrested for wounding a black motorist who had simply reached for his driver license as ordered. Now, last words that were actually our first, with Gil Gross of the old RKO Radio Network as co-host of the debut Newsweek On Air broadcast on April 25, 1982, and as a guest on our 25th anniversary.
The presses are rolling at Newsweek, and we'll be talking to the reporters, the columnists, and the newsmakers who are featured in Newsweek this week.
I'm Newsweek senior editor Dave Alpern.
And I'm RKO correspondent Gil Gross. Welcome.
Our very first story was on a crisis still confounding us.
No more war, no more bloodshed, no more bereavement. Peace unto you. Shalom, salam forever.
When Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and the late Egyptian President Anwar Sadat reached a peace agreement with U.S. President Jimmy Carter at Camp David, it began a new era of relationships in the Middle East. But with Israel's formal return of the Sinai Desert to Egypt this weekend, that era is ending, and there are very serious questions about what will happen next.
We have Newsweek diplomatic correspondent John Walcott on the line with us from Washington. John, with the Sinai going back to Egypt now, what do you see as the biggest roadblock to a Middle East peace?
Well, obviously, Gil, the biggest roadblock is the Palestinian problem. And I think it's important to recognize that the Palestinian problem and the invasion of Lebanon are very closely related. Since Camp David, the United States, Israel, and Egypt have been trying to negotiate some form of self-government for the over 1 million Arabs who live on the West Bank and in Gaza. They've gotten nowhere. The United States has never really pushed that idea hard. And Prime Minister Begin and Defense Minister Sharon have really been free to pursue their own policy on the West Bank, which amounts to extending a form of second-class citizenship to the Arabs who live there. The problem with doing that is the PLO. The PLO resists. The PLO is armed. It has an ability to kill Israeli soldiers and Jewish settlers. It's controlled from Lebanon. So ultimately, if you're going to pacify the West Bank in the fashion that Begin seems to want to, you have to destroy the PLO where it lives, which means you have to go into Lebanon.
Israel did occupy Lebanon for years, but ultimately had to withdraw. The Palestinian problem continues, most recently with new fighting across the Gaza border. The first Newsweek On Air also considered a looming war between Argentina and Britain over the Falkland Islands and a familiar battle over the federal budget.
For more than a month now, the White House and congressional leaders have been trying to work out a compromise on President Reagan's proposed budget for the coming fiscal year. For a while last week, it seemed that they might come up with something, but time and again, the announcement was postponed, and in the end, it seemed that a detailed deal would be put off until at least this coming week, maybe indefinitely. David, seems to be a kind of a spectator sport to many Americans. There's a lot riding on a resolution of this budget fandango, the state of the nation's economy, interest rates, money available for social programs.
That's true. And to shed some light on the problems preventing a budget settlement, we've got White House correspondent Eleanor Clift on the line now and congressional correspondent Gloria Borger. Eleanor, at the beginning of the week, it seemed that the White House was beginning to show a little more willingness to tamper with President Reagan's original budget proposal. What prompted that flourish of flexibility?
Well, I think that flexibility has been present for a couple of weeks, if not months, as Ronald Reagan sees the economy deteriorating around him. And I believe there is broad agreement on the part of those that are negotiating, Democrats, Republicans, on what needs to be done. The problem is politics. I think the Democrats are about to conclude there's more in it for them come the November congressional elections if they don't bail Ronald Reagan out on the economy. And I think we may see a stalemate.
Gloria Borger, is there a personality problem between these two most important figures in the budget debate, the President and Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill?
Well, Tip O'Neill is always the first to tell you that Ronald Reagan is a fine fella and that after 6 o'clock at night they get together and get along very well. I think the problem here is that they have some very, very basic differences on their attitude towards government.
There were lighter topics, too, on that first show. Atlanta's winning baseball Braves, Knoxville's World's Fair, and black comic Richard Pryor.
Because I was watching TV, man, I was all bandaged up, and they said I was going to die. They said, Richard Pryor died 5 minutes ago. Oh, no!
Richard Pryor set himself ablaze one day while freebasing, making a potent batch of cocaine. This is a man who shot up his car, set a girlfriend's mink stole on fire, went to jail on a tax charge, has had fist fights with his co-stars, been through 4 marriages, and has used language on TV and on stage that would make a sailor's parrot blush. But he is also just about the hottest performer around. Richard Pryor is our Newsweek cover story this week, and Los Angeles correspondent David Friendly is with us to talk about him. David, tell us something about the background of Richard Pryor.
His roots are as unlikely, I think, as his success today. He's from Peoria, Illinois, and he goes back to that often. He grew up not as a poor, struggling black man as one might think from his comedy, but in a fairly middle-class upbringing. And he is, I think his success is just so surprising to so many people today, and they view him as a real overnight success when, in fact, he's been in this business for more than 2 decades now.
We tried adding a little humor of our own.
We would have played more Richard Pryor, but the FCC still licenses a lot of radio stations.
It's called Pryor restraint.
Ooh. Joining us now is the original co-host of Newsweek On Air, Gil Gross. What do you remember most about that first show in the early years of Newsweek On Air?
What I remember about it is the two of us being given this assignment and just sort of sitting over coffee in the Newsweek building, inventing this thing. I have since worked on programs for large networks with tons of consultants that have expired after 3 months. I'm just thinking how funny it is the two of us came up with this thing that's lasted 25 years.
Ending now after more than 32, and so pleased for the chance to do it for your ears only.